Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday as we round out the end of the year. This podcast started in early spring, and here we are 9 months later. As I said in the first episode, I originally created this podcast to keep my creative wheels turning, and I was thrilled to have so many writers and authors join in the fun. Thank you for taking a chance with the new podcast. I learned so much from all of you. This goes to not only my guests, but those who jumped into our comments on our social media platforms. Hopefully, we created some fun and educational content that served as a launching pad to even bigger and greater ideas. So, what can we look forward to in the new year? I'll be batch recording first thing, which means I won't have regular episodes until February. But don't worry, each week in January will feature an author takeover. I don't even know what they're planning to say, so I'm just as excited to find out. Stick around to learn more about plot devices, story structures, and writing advice from their different perspectives and experiences. As always, please don't forget to subscribe to Speculative Sandbox wherever you stream your podcasts. And if it doesn't take too much time, please consider leaving us a review. See you next year. So what kind of protagonist do you think is more interesting to viewers, to readers currently? Do they want someone that's more nuanced, like Daenerys Targaryen, or do they want something more black and white? What are your thoughts?
It depends on what you're talking about. Obviously, everyone's going to like different characters for different situations. But I do think at the end of the day, people just love to debate. And when you have a character that you can argue about, that makes for a very interesting protagonist.
Even if you just want to go with the bionic, looking what we can do now for amputees, but imagine what it's going to be in 10 years. Who has control of that arm? Who has the algorithm?
Oh yeah. Especially if the arm is on Wi-Fi, like smart devices in your house.
Exactly. So does that mean Uncle Fred says something against the government? They make me smack him? I mean, again, that's what dystopian future is. We're taking the far extreme.
That might be okay. That one situation that's humorous.
But does suddenly I'm registered for one party, the other party's in control? Do my arms and legs not work on election day?
It gives us an escape. There's so much about literature that, it's comforting to be able to sit down and get away from, what's going on in the real world, especially these past couple of years living in a pandemic, and there's awful things happening in other countries and such. And so it's comforting at first to sit down and read about a place where, things could be perfect, and to imagine what could be, and to, think about these possibilities. But I think on the flip side, utopian literature kind of gives us a cautionary tale sometimes, because inevitably we see these examples of why it's not working. And so, when I finish reading something or watching something where a utopian society seems perfect in the beginning and then it starts to all fall apart by the end, at the end, I'm comforted to come back to the real world.
You have physical immortality, and then you have spiritual immortality. So a zombie is experiencing physical immortality and not spiritual immortality, because they are a shell of their former selves. Like a ghost or reincarnated person is experiencing spiritual immortality.
So hypothetically, if your zombie body shell is just zombieing around, you could become a ghost and just watch yourself from a distant perspective. You're like, well, shit. Or you're reincarnated and you become your future victim. For any writer wanting to write a really good dark triad personality or combination of it into their work, what would be your main advice?
I don't think it would hurt to read true crime if you have the stomach for it. I think that having some familiarity with some of these personalities will help you to make better villains. If your villain is going to be one of these larger than life kind of villains like you see in epic fantasy, for instance.
I think redemption is a huge one. I've seen that through many, many myths, and kind of obviously really played into that with my modern retellings. I think opposites attract is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of tropes. Second chances that we talked about, grumpy and sunshine.
Well, there is the doomed mentor. There's suddenly this expectation that the hero is now invincible because they got plot armor. If the mentor is doomed, well, the guy or the girl they were teaching, they're going to be okay. And I feel that's an unrealistic expectation for you and me just trying to cross.
It's Westerns, pirates, but also the Roman Empire. That tends to get recycled a lot in terms of sort of intergalactic empires. And they all look suspiciously Roman. They all have the senators, they all have the emperor and the palace intrigue. So those are kind of, I think those are the staples, the sort of the Venn diagram of science fiction in a lot of ways. Most of Western literature kind of has the sort of classical models of Rome and Greece and Egypt are our kind of precursor civilizations, and we took a lot from them wholesale.
The Golden Age was written for children, for small children. Superman fighting aliens and imps, and Batman being tied to a giant penny and rolled down the hill. I think what you get when you get into later, grittier versions where they did try to put it in realism, and Marvel, that was their whole thing. Marvel, Stanley used to joke, you pick up a building in the DC universe and it has a flat bottom. You pick up ours and you see pipes and electric conduit. But you have to change it with the times, with technology. The secret identity is an outdated concept because of social media, because of CRT cameras.
I mentioned Brandon Sanderson earlier. He has this great thing. It's not specifically about endings. It's about sort of all the different climaxes, big plot points throughout a novel or a story. And he has this great thing where he calls it a yes, but, or a no, and. And so the yes, but is like your hero is successful, but there's something goes wrong or there's some sort of fallout. And then there's a no, and, which is we failed. And there's like a pretty negative repercussion for that failure. And I feel like the happily ever after good endings is like a yes and.
Human beings look for patterns. In the caveman days, the caveman who could see like, oh, this berry of this shade with this shape of leaves is poisonous, I shouldn't eat it. That caveman got to live longer and have more offspring. We were incentivized to look for patterns everywhere. Now, that's just on a grander scale. It's not necessarily for our survival and what we're going to eat, but now we have the internet. We all have this device in the palm of our hands that gives us access to so much information. The conspiracy theory provides that.
When you're writing anything, it doesn't even matter what it is, not just ghost stories, but when you're writing anything, you have to conceptualize where you want to go. But then you also have to research it to the point that you yourself have not become an expert, but you've become open-minded enough about the possibility of whatever this concept is, that you could take that leap into the imaginary, or into the an area that maybe even scares you a little bit. And because they always,
in the book, there is this sense that there's these sports leagues, some of which allow cybernetics and some of which don't. We are heading towards a future in which there is a lot of body modification that will be possible. And we're already in a certain sense there, right? I grew up in the 90s, Major League Baseball's big steroid scandals. And there was lots of debates about, what counts as proper athletics and what is just chemistry. And my thinking, not about what I personally believe, but in what I think humans might settle on, is that things that modify the body to too large of an extent that it feels unhuman to the viewer, so cybernetics, right, like a truly robotic arm, would maybe be banned by sports league.
They basically create this banking system so that they can kind of like pay you below minimum wage, essentially. And then, you get assigned dorm rooms, essentially, and just not very nice. And it's kind of spinning off this idea of a couple of inspirations. One is Shenzhen and Foxconn, like these iPhone cities where they have these big facilities where they manufacture electronics, and you live there and you work there. But because you get like, free room and board, they expect you to work like 7 days a week, 12 hours a day for like nothing.
June, I've always really struggled with people's love for, because when I read it, I was horrified as a teenager. I actually stopped reading Dune because the representation of the Baron is so sort of caricatured and hateful. I think that's a very clear example of an author weaponizing sexuality, because the Baron's sexuality is a point of disgust. It's part of what makes him reprehensible. Now, obviously, he isn't just a gay character. He's a pedophile and also an incestuous one, but it's kind of like tying into every possible negative caricature.
You know, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is obviously stacked with battle scenes and fight scenes. My personal favorite is the Battle of Amon Hen, which is the final battle in the Fellowship of the Ring. Dramatic tension and emotion is just through the roof. That's where they all separate, because Frodo realizes that he has to finish the quest on his own, and Aragorn is like, yeah, he does. And so really the whole point of that is just the Fellowship is fighting so that Frodo can get away.
The romanticism of like swooping in magic, that someone can somehow have ESP and know you're on the train tracks, and they ride 1,000,000 miles to come save you. I mean, that stuff's really cool. But boiling it all down, though, it feels troublesome from an expectation standpoint.
The big sacrifice that the chosen one has to make at the end.
Oh, yes.
I had Frodo again, because he's obviously, I think it's like he's got semi like PTSD. He can't really live a normal life, can he? He's just kind of mentally and physically scarred from what they went through. And he like goes on the ship with the elves at the end, and like basically will never go back to Middle Earth, and he's kind of just like traumatized. So it's like, yeah, I'm gonna go because I can't live a normal life here. So that's, he's dealing with the mental scars of what he had to go through. So that feels like a big sacrifice.
So the idea of garbage in, garbage out is that when you train your model or you run your statistics on bad data, you get bad results. Amazon got in trouble because they were running an AI recruiting tool that basically rejecting minority applicants. The AI was not being malicious. The AI itself, I mean, you could say it's racist, but like, it's not somebody like wrote code saying like, oh, well, if they listed their ethnicity as whatever, then reject them. It was that it was trained on data where humans had been practicing racist recruiting. Like, people were rejecting these applicants, and the AI just learned to do the same thing.
I called mine the Nebula. It's a rum citrus punch that is both frozen and a gas. So I guess it's a combination of like eating a snow cone. And I realized when I said gas, and vaping, not that I vape, but I wanted that Nebula feel of like an inner gas. But basically, yes, it's sort of like a cross between a nebula and a frozen comet, or one of these frozen moons.
Mine is called the Rings of Saturn. And so the way it's going to be presented to you is like in a ball, and you slurp from the planet, but then you you top it off with a bite from the rings.
I like it.
There's like, Saturn doesn't have a surface, right? I mean, it's gaseous.
Yeah.
And liquidy.
Exactly. And then the rings are icy bits.
The throwaway god was kind of like just a sort of silly one. And that's Karen, the goddess of perceived injustice. But she's not very good at working out what is correct injustice and what is just perceived injustice. And she fills people with her anger. So when someone acts out and wants to see the manager, they are literally taken over by the spirit of Karen, which is something we actually all recognize as a society, which is why we respond. We all go to them, all right, Karen, all right, Karen. We are trying to placate the goddess behind them, not the
a Western dragon, depending on if you're a wyvern or not, there's usually a basis that's the same, usually wings, depending if you have front claws or not. A wyvern has small, almost think of like T-Rex arms. They don't support themselves on it.
Okay.
But they can use it to grab, versus a fledged dragon, a full-fledged, which has front legs to support themselves. but big leathery wings, the fork tail or, devil's tail. From a Western perspective, it will depend. Some have horns, some don't.
Okay, what are your thoughts on an incoming meteor?
This is one I have actually trained for.
Ooh,
So-
is it like Armageddon?
Sort of.
Okay.
The approach to response to this is the same as if we knew a hurricane or another natural disaster was coming. So what happens with that is the fire department assists the police and military in the immediate evacuation of people from the anticipated impact site and their site around that might be affected.
How
That is your
easy is
initial.
that to do?
Not very easy. There's a lot of stubborn people that don't want to leave.
Okay.
And that ends up putting first responders at risk, because if you have the general public still left behind, you have to have first responders to assist them in the inevitable.
If we look at to a lot of myths, we can see this happening. In Ireland, we have myths about the great giant coming across the strait there, and all of those landscape names that we still have today are based on these stories that we told each other for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. So that kind of naming is really exciting for me as a writer, as a fiction writer. How can I suggest 1,000 years of history, of storytelling history within my story without, writing a single paragraph about it? Well, one way is to name correctly and to have that name evoke something that we're going to be familiar with through that kind of cultural, hereditary experience of naming things in this way.
The post-apocalypse movies or TV shows, they're just taking their old Westerns and retelling them in a post-apocalypse, because you always assume the post-apocalypse operates under the same rules, that it's sparsely populated, there's some sort of population of war-like tribes or natives or zombies or robots or something out there that's a lingering threat, but that it's a world that doesn't have, it's not a world of jobs and memos and dress codes and cubicles. It's a world, because that's what's attractive about post-apocalypse, because imagine all of the stress of your life, no more bills.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.